Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. As always, every week, talking about the latest things in Chargers land. And again, not much going on this week, so I did want to do something a little bit different. I know a couple weeks ago, Steven and Tyler talked about the top 10 most important Chargers list of talking about the specific players that are really important when we end up defining the success or failure of the 2023 season in a lot of respects, but I wanted to look at it from a bit of a different angle because obviously I can tell you, hey, Justin Herbert's the most important Chargers player. I can tell you Rashawn Slater's top 5 because he plays left tackle and he's really good at what he does. Joey Bosa if he's on the field, et cetera, et cetera. But I wanted to approach it from a bit of a different angle this week and talk about, when we talk about X Factor storylines for the Chargers entering this season, what will determine their success or failure. So we will talk about some individual player ones, but just when we look back on this season, what are some of the macro narratives that will be answered in the process of this 2023 Charger season, and looking back in January and February, if we get to that point, but what will determine success or failure. So without any further ado, I will get into the list. So starting off, I will get to number 10 here. And number 10, I think, is a little bit of a simple one, something that we've talked about a lot of times, I think, on this podcast and on the show. Running back production behind Austin Ekeler. So these are Joshua Kelly and Isaiah Spiller's 2022 numbers. Joshua Kelly missed 4 games last year, but was pretty good when he played as running back too. 69 rushes, 287 yards, 4.2 yards per attempt, 4.7 yards per touch, factoring in receptions, and 4 touchdowns. Isaiah Spiller, pretty limited in terms of when the Chargers decided to use him, was a healthy scratch on a lot of games. 18 rushes, 41 yards, and 2.3 yards per attempt. So when we talk about running back production behind Ekeler, I think it's important, obviously, for the future of the Chargers, right? Because Austin Ekeler and Joshua Kelly are probably not going to be players that are here for the long term. This is probably both of their last years with the team. So for 2023, both of those players are in contract years, but in terms of what the Chargers are able to get behind Ekeler, and potentially decrease his usage a little bit, right? Ekeler has always had sky-high usage rates in both the receiving game, the run game, specifically because the Chargers really, and Ekeler's publicly lamented this in the past, haven't had that running back 2 presence behind him. I think Joshua Kelly did a pretty good job at being that guy last year, but I still think the Chargers need a little bit more, both out of Kelly and increasing some of Spiller's usage too. Or if the Chargers maybe don't think Spiller's is viable, finding a running back on the free agent market. Obviously, we talked about some free agent names potentially last week, but there are still running backs available if the Chargers want to kind of do another Sony Michel experiment like they did last year and just bring in another veteran if they're not feeling quite as comfortable with the room. But I still think from the perspective of keeping Ekeler fresh later in the season, because of how he's going to be used in this Kellen Moore offense and how much he's going to be relied upon, I do think this is a situation where Joshua Kelly and Isaiah Spiller stepping up, I would say specifically the latter of those two, can determine a lot for the Chargers in terms of how varied the Chargers offense can be, how versatile it can be, and specifically, again, how deep the running back room is. God forbid something did happen to Ekeler or happens to Joshua Kelly. Is there really a next man up mentality, or are we kind of getting more of the same from the running back room behind Austin? So I think that is my number 10 X factor for the Chargers in 2023. Number 9, Staley on 4th downs. Obviously, Staley came into 2021 being big ball Staley, everything that everyone wanted to call him, and of course got crucified in the media by old school media after the Raiders lost, even though, that 4th down from the 23 or whatever is not the whole reason they lost that game. But he did get, pretty eviscerated in the media after that 2021 season for the 4th down stuff. Obviously, a lot of the people in the analytics community, and I would say me, Steven, Tyler, and Arjun were pretty universally behind him in that respect, in terms of defending the 4th down decisions and stuff like that, while, a lot of the talking heads kind of, rained down upon Staley. But 2022 was different. And, you could kind of go through a litany of reasons as to why it was different. Did the media pressure get to him? In Staley's own words, as I put the podcast tweet up, Brandon Staley in his end of season press conference after the Jaguars loss did say that injuries on offense and the improvement of Ryan Fick and special teams, both of those things occurring at the same time, led to a little bit more of a conservative approach on fourth downs in 2022, particularly on offense. But that kind of makes sense. But I do think the consistency in the decision making left a lot to be desired, because as I have pictured here, is the infamous Michael Davis, infamous Cade York miss by the Browns, in which Brandon Staley went for 4th and 2 and gave the Browns the ball back and a chance to win. And that was a highly, lamented 4th down decision from him. So despite the fact that, Staley kind of says he went more conservative, it was maybe the least conservative 4th down decision of Brandon Staley's career, aside maybe from the Raiders call on the, 4th down. But this was, end of the game situation where you're giving the Browns the ball back, and if they make that field goal, you're kind of screwed. Staley gets bailed out of that one, and it was a little bit lucky to kind of live another day with that decision. But for me, again, we could talk about the reasons that Staley said, and I do believe they are true in terms of what he's saying. More injuries on the offense, and, Ficken being a better special teams coordinator, J.K. Scott coming on as he did. All of that can lead to less aggressiveness on 4th down. But I do still think there are just moments that you see, even in the Jaguars playoff game as example, where, on 4th downs, it did feel like Doug Peterson was kind of playing to win versus Staley, kind of reserving himself to more of a not to lose mentality, despite having a lot of his guys back. Again, there were parts of that game where they were preserving a 27-0 lead, but again, as the game got closer, it just felt like as a coach, Doug got kind of more aggressive, and Staley, on 4th downs and in situational football, kind of clamped up. And so I do want to see if we do get the return of the original 2021 Brandon Staley with all the offensive weapons that he has, if the Chargers are healthy. And I'm curious to see how maybe he balances, again, 4th down aggressiveness with Ficken's, special teams being as good as it was last year, right? And if Ficken's, special teams level does keep up in that regard, does Staley still revert back to 2021 a little bit and up the aggressiveness to help the Chargers, or is it a bit of a, maybe a mix between 2021 and 2022 Staley on 4th downs? Number 8 on my list, if it'll load here for me, development of the 2022 draft class. I went through multiple clicks there. Development of the 2022 draft class. How deep are the Chargers in reality, I think, will be determined by, we already mentioned Spiller when we talked about the running backs in the first slide and at number 10. But essentially, we have Jamari Salyer and Zion Johnson from this draft who are proven starters who are going to be on key parts of that offensive line. But I think when we talk about depth, what is JT Woods at this point? And Brandon Staley kind of said, we'll find out in training camp when we put the pads on. The same can kind of be said, from the coaching staff's perspective on Isaiah Spiller and then some of these other players. Otito Ogbonnia, obviously a little bit of a different situation, nursing an injury. But I do think that this is kind of the difference between being deep enough to really make a Super Bowl push and then just kind of like having players who may or may not provide that depth, right, at certain times. And if JT Woods comes on strong, you have him, Derwin, and Alohi Gilman, right? So that obviously makes that group a little bit deeper. If Isaiah Spiller is a true running back 3 who can push for RB2, that makes you feel a lot better about the Chargers running back room. And same as you go down the list. If Jaw Taylor is a really good slot corner and you can kind of go on and off with him in ASJ, that makes you feel really good about that group. If John Taylor is a bit of a liability, though, and then you're still kind of wondering about the, health of J.C. Jackson on the outside, then you got some problems, right? So overall, I think that, the Chargers 2022 draft class and 2023 draft class, past some of the top picks, has some of the same perspective of, draft and stash. I hope that we get to see some of these guys, taken out of the plastic wrap a little bit and, truly unleashed for the team this year. Obviously, there's exceptions to that. Dean Leonard, probably still mostly a special teams player. Xander Horvath, while we hope for an increased role, probably, again, depends on how much Kellen Moore wants to use the fullback in certain situations. But I do think you want to see more from specifically JT, Isaiah Spiller, Otito coming back from injury, and then Ja, right? So the step that the 2022 draft class, or the rest of the 2022 draft class, I should say, the step that they take this year can be really important for the Chargers in determining whether they're, a Super Bowl deep team or whether they, have some nicks and bruises along the way. Number 7, as I previewed a little bit ago, the contract year for Kenneth Murray. So the Chargers obviously declined the 5th-year option. Kenneth Murray is only the second Charger to have his 5th-year option declined after Jerry Tillery, obviously the year before. And I think you could look at this from a lot of ways, right? The positive things, he gets to work with Eric Kendricks. And I think last year he actually did show some development in terms of coverage and diagnosis, which was a bit of a rough thing for him to begin with, but he kind of even got worse as a tackler and a run defender. And you can look on PFF, you can look at whatever source you want to go to for the numbers on K9 and tackling and run defense as a whole, but the picture is not a pretty one to paint. And so I do question, as I said, this is only the second 5th-year option that has been declined in the Telesco era. And I wonder from the Chargers' perspective how much they want to, again, avoid what happened with Jerry Tillery last year. Again, Jerry Tillery and Kenneth Murray are 2 different people, 2 different situations, 2 different positions, et cetera, et cetera. But, I do think if you get a really strong year from Kenneth Murray, that bolsters this linebacker group. If the declined 5th-year option, potentially causes some problems in the locker room, or you're just maybe not getting the best version of Kenneth Murray, even though it's a contract year, then that might be, time to turn to Dion a little bit, as we saw with, say, the trade-off between like Morgan Fox and Jerry Tillery last year. Again, not saying that's going to happen, but I do think it's really important to get a good year from Kenneth Murray because he's going to be a starting linebacker along with Kendricks. I know a lot of people, again, have expectations for Dion, but he's obviously going to kind of start the season at least as a special teamer for Ryan Ficken, and then we'll see where he goes from there. But I do think this being a contract year, and particularly, again, the Chargers having the problems at the 2nd and 3rd levels, particularly in the linebacker room and some in the secondary when it comes to, runs that got to the outside, this is going to be a problem where you got to clean some of that stuff up. And I think some of it does start with Kenneth Murray, and, hopefully getting to work with Eric Kendricks produces a good year for him so he can get paid, obviously, in the future, but produces a good year for the Chargers in the interim. Number 6, I want to talk about Staley's situational defense. So this is kind of a little bit more of a specific thing than what I talked about earlier, but the Chargers had a weird 2022 in terms of where they kind of peaked, right? Obviously, they struggled on 3rd down a lot when you talk about those first 8 or 10 games of the season, then kind of got hot towards the end of the season. Now, the Raiders, Dolphins, Titans, and Colts and Rams offenses were not necessarily, running a gauntlet, so to speak, but still, they only allowed, as Eric Smith posted the stat, 24.5% 3rd down conversions, in that span. And, it did feel like they were going somewhere. Obviously, they started the Jags game really well. Michael Davis gets hurt. And the rest is, history in that regard when it comes to the defense and breaking down in the second half. So I'm really curious just to see from how much of an up and down season it was from players circling into the lineup, circling back out of the lineup, if they can get a little bit more consistency this year when it comes to 3rd down. And that's going to be really critical when you play a team like the Chiefs, when you play a team, any of the teams, the Bills, the Ravens, any of the teams the Chargers have on their schedule that have some of these explosive offenses, you just cannot break as much as the Chargers did on 3rd down. This was kind of a, the term bend don't break defense was used, but for large parts of the 2022 season, this was a bend and break defense until they sort of started to figure out some things towards the end of the year, but again, with the opponents they played and how much of this is transferable to 2023, I think is the question. And then I posted turnover differential because I wanted to kind of get into that, but essentially the Chargers are really high on turnover differential last year because I think they were top 10, because they, weren't committing, they weren't throwing a lot of interceptions, they weren't throwing a lot of fumbles, but also Staley's defense wasn't forcing the most turnovers per se. So I would like to see, again, combined with third down stops, more turnover creation, and, that kind of balances itself out, right? I don't mind Herbert taking a couple more chances, throwing a couple more picks if the defense can be a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more ball hawkish and create more interceptions and fumbles in that regard too. Number 5, Tuli Tuipulotu's impact. I think that this is something that has maybe gone under the radar, but the Chargers are going to get some work out of Tuli this year. Obviously, he's in a critical role, edge 3, in replacing Kyle Van Noy, who, again, as people remember, sort of at the beginning of the season bounced around between linebacker and edge. But as the season went on, he got better. I think he have like that span where he had 5 sacks in 5 weeks or something like that. And he really stepped up, from a pass rushing standpoint. Obviously, Kyle Van Noy is not Joey Bosa in terms of doing all of the Joey Bosa things, like being a run defender and all that. But he stepped up when he needed to, when Bosa got hurt, and he was primarily playing edge along with Khalil Mack, right? And now Tuli is kind of going to be that guy. He's going to be the next man up, or at least the Chargers are going to give him the opportunity to earn that in training camp. Maybe they'll bring in another body at some point. Maybe he'll, have a competition with Rumpf, so to speak. But Tuli is eventually going to be that guy unless the Chargers bring in someone else at this point. And to be able to step in when Joey Bosa can't play, or if Khalil Mack has to go out for a drive, that's a huge role. And I think when you talk about what Tuli was at USC, right, he's a top tier pass rusher, right? I believe he was, almost 95th percentile in terms of pressure rate last year, right? Like he absolutely has a good pass rush win rate, has good technique, but there is work to do as a run stopper and a tackler when it comes to Tuli. And one of the things that Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack are really good at is tackling and run defense. Tuli last year had a 31.4% missed tackle rate, and also was not even, I think, in the 50th percentile per PFF as a run defender. And creating run stops specifically. So I think that that's when we talk about Tuli and how important he is to this defense. I'll talk about the edge a little bit later in my list, because there is a specific player in his availability that I want to talk about. But Tuli being in this edge 3 role, being one of the most important, starting roles for a non-first rounder that the Chargers have really gotten in a long time. Obviously, they had Jamari, who had to step in for Slater last year. But this is going into the season, assuming no injuries. Tuli's going to play an important role. How does it pan out? We'll see. And then at number 4, I have the return of J.C. Jackson. I will also talk about, kind of the return of another Charger in a second. But J.C. Jackson in 2022, prior to the, torn patella tendon that took him out for the rest of the season, it was very up and down. He had his moments in the Seattle game, obviously, as people remember, but really struggled, particularly kind of hit a rough patch in the Denver game where he eventually got benched for Michael Davis. Rough moments in the Kansas City game, and you can look at his PFF grades. There's a lot of red here in terms of his ability in coverage. His ability as a defender and tackler as a whole was pretty up and down throughout the season, right? And there were certain communication things that I think you could really hone in on, where JC just kind of didn't even know specifically where he was supposed to be at points, because again, the defense was new to him. He missed a lot of time in training camp and then was coming back into this environment. And, the thing that got him benched, people remember in the Denver game, was allowing a 39-yard pass to Greg Dulcich, where he was supposed to be the one, on him in that scenario. So I think JC being more comfortable in year 2, and Steven and Tyler talked about this with Ted Nguyen on their Chargers podcast earlier this week, but be more comfortable with this in year 2, be more comfortable just specifically taking that man coverage is going to be really important. And again, how he returns from that rupture athletically, right? That's going to be a big thing too, in terms of, is he able to track the ball as well and follow people and play that lockdown coverage that the Chargers need from, their potential CB1. So I have the return of J.C. Jackson pretty high on my list, simply because, and Ted Nguyen said this on the Chargers podcast that Steven and Tyler did as well. If you have a true lockdown corner like J.C. Jackson and he's playing like he should be, or playing like you paid him to be, it frees up a lot of the defense to do other things, right? Instead of, Derwin having to be so worried at, say the third level of the defense, it frees him up to wreak more havoc at the first, second, and third levels. And you could talk about the domino effect to the rest of the defense if you get a true lockdown CP1 performance out of J.C. Jackson this season. He returns to what he was back in New England. If you don't, again, that spells trouble because of some of the weaknesses that we talked about in the Chargers cornerback room, and specifically just dealing with his injury and trying to reconfigure that. So overall, pretty optimistic about the return of J.C. Jackson, but I would call it, again, cautious optimism, and it's a big storyline and X factor for the Chargers, obviously, going into 2023. I also want to talk about someone else's availability at number 3, and it's the availability of Joey Bosa. I think, honestly, when you talk about who are like the top 3 Chargers non-quarterback, MVP candidates, so to speak, for me, it's 3 players. I think that it's Rashawn Slater, obviously being at left tackle, Joey Bosa being at edge, and then JC at being at premium position and being the premium corner in that Staley defense. Those are the 3 guys who, if they ball out, can, again, have really big roles on this team this year. And, it will go long ways in terms of determining their success. But focusing in on Bosa specifically, the Chargers struggled a lot to stop the run game when he was not on the field last year. I talked about in my last video, specifically how much the Chargers struggled against outside runs. And this was something that was just terrible for them last year because they did not have Joey Bosa out there. And Joey Bosa is a really good run defender. And they, struggled a lot in terms of allowing like 8.36 yards per attempt or something crazy like that on outside runs. They struggled in terms of generating as much pass rush pressure as they would have if Joey Bosa played. And, the thing about Joey Bosa's, injury that sucked last year is that Joey Bosa, like when he plays, is still really good, right? Again, it's a small sample size, so don't go comparing this information to TJ Watt and some of the other premier edge defenders around the league. But in 104 pass rush snaps last year, Joey Bosa had 17 pressures, which is good enough for 17% pressure rate, which would put him, again, if you expand that to a whole season, up there with some of the top edges in the league and one of the better Joey Bosa seasons. Obviously, because of the groin injury, we just didn't get to see that last year. So I do still think he is that top 5 guy when he is healthy. It's just about getting past kind of, the chronic lower body injuries for him at this point. And I do hope he really has a chance to do that because, again, him and Khalil Mack on the field together is a really great idea in theory, but I hope we can see it in practice. Number 2, I have a Herbert that's ready to move again. So Justin Herbert, this was pure pocket passing passer rating. So Justin Herbert was 12th in the league with a 93.2. Sorry, that's not passer rating. 93.2 quarterback rating when he was, purely in the pocket last year. And this goes back to what my number 1 point will be, which will be the change at offensive coordinator. But Justin Herbert is kind of at his best when he's rolling to the left, rolling to the right, outside the pocket, and making a decision there, whether that's to, chuck a big ball to Mike Williams down on the sideline, or even just deciding to take off and maybe pick up an extra 5 or 10 yards, take an easy play. People have been talking about the need for Herbert to run again, and getting Herbert more naturally outside the pocket than the contained, Lombardi inside the pocket. I do think getting him back to what we saw with Herbert in 2020 and parts of 2021 will be critical in that regard. Now, there are reasons the Chargers could not move Herbert as much outside of the pocket last year. It had to do with the injuries to the offensive line, had to do with the injuries to Justin Herbert. Of course, had the torn labrum later in the year and very earlier in the year. The Chargers very clearly wanted to play cautious with Justin Herbert's broken ribs. And that was a storyline throughout the season in terms of both Herbert's mobility, them protecting Herbert, and all of these kinds of things. And clearly, through at least the first 2.5 months of the season, it did have a big impact on the Chargers offense. So you hope that Herbert's a little bit more free this year, because as you can see in this graph Arjun made, this is from 2021 data. But Herbert is essentially one of those top 3 guys, top 4 guys, whatever term you want to use. But when it comes to Josh Allen and Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes, making those plays outside of structure is what those guys do. And actually, if you go back to 2021, I think in terms of PFF grade outside the pocket as passers, the top 3 were Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, and Patrick Mahomes. So, you want to see, again, Herbert's really good inside the pocket. I don't have any qualms about that, but the most explosive Justin Herbert in terms of getting all those kinds of plays per game, or the most outside the pocket plays you get out of Justin Herbert, the better, right? And that's really what we've seen again and again from the data, and again from Herbert's standpoint. So I do hope that my number 1 guy on the list, Kellen Moore, gets Justin Herbert kind of out on the move again and stuff like that. But the number 1 spot, obviously, in terms of determining the Chargers' success or failure in 2023, is Kellen Moore's offense and all the changes that he can make, right? Again, some of the changes that I just talked about are pretty easy in terms of, getting Herbert out on the move and just making the offense feel a little less cramped in general. But how's he going to use, some of the personnel, right? How is he going to, exploit Quentin Johnston to be some of that big weapon that the Chargers have been lacking, right? We kind of know how Keenan and Mike are going to be used in the system a little bit, but, can we get a little bit more creative with how we use Austin Ekeler instead of just like dumping down checkdowns to him and like giving him 107 receptions, right? Can we be a little bit more creative in how we use one of the more efficient running backs in the league? So again, it is a personnel thing. Can we draw up some stuff again for Gerald Everett and Donald Parham, who I think is a really underrated tight end duo when healthy. And Kellen Moore loves exploiting, guys' size. We saw this in Dallas when he had, Amari Cooper and all those guys. So I hope he brings some of that here too. And Kellen Moore's insinuated this. I think he said on the podcast with Peter Schrager, right, we're going to be throwing into a new jet stream when talking about Quentin Johnston and Mike Williams and all these guys being big, right? So, creatively, I think Kellen Moore, as we said, has an opportunity to bring some of that Dallas ingenuity here. And, we've talked about this, I guess, for months at this point, but how good was Dallas in the red zone last year? How good was Dallas's offense as a whole? How good was Dallas as a scoring offense, et cetera, et cetera? They put up points on the board. They converted third downs a lot of the time. They converted in the red zone. And that's what you really want in a Chargers Justin Herbert, led offense. And that can create some opportunity for him to potentially get into MVP consideration and all that stuff. If the Kellen Moore offense is a dud, then the Chargers season was probably pretty likely a dud, unless they had a generational Brandon Staley performance, which, considering the health of that defense and the players coming in and coming back and what percentage they are, I would say that the Chargers probably, again, have to lean more on their offense this year in general, and lean more on Kellen Moore as a whole. So Kellen Moore's offense, pretty clearly the biggest determiner in terms of the Chargers' success going forward here into 2023. And clearly, when we look back as to where we are at the end of the season with Kellen Moore potentially getting a head coaching job, or, potentially, if the offense is a bust, the Chargers losing other jobs, Kellen Moore will be the biggest success determiner for 2023 and for the Chargers going forward. But that's it for my video today. So hope you guys liked it. Let me know in the comments below, what is your number 1 X factor? If I didn't mention it, or if I did mention it in this video, let me know down in the comments below what your number 1 X factor is for the Chargers' success or failure in 2023. And as always, bolt up.